Are you going to say anything at all?
My husband brought his pregnant mistress home. He never expected what I did next. The announcement. Rebecca Carter stood in her kitchen in Preston Hollow, Dallas, stirring a pot of gumbo the way her grandmother taught her 30 years ago in a small kitchen in Shreveport. The house smelled like bay leaf and thyme, and the faint sweetness of caramelized onion. Outside, the late afternoon sun cut gold lines across the granite countertop she had picked out herself 12 years earlier, back when she still believed this marriage was something permanent, something built to last the way her grandmother's cast iron skillet had lasted 3 generations. She heard the garage door open. She heard 2 sets of footsteps instead of one,
Are you going to say
and
anything
something
at
in her
all?
chest went still before her mind had even caught up to why. Daniel walked in first, holding the hand of a young woman Rebecca had never seen in her life. The woman was beautiful in the deliberate, expensive way of someone who had learned early that beauty was currency, and she was visibly, unmistakably 7 months pregnant. Daniel didn't look nervous. He didn't look ashamed. He looked, Rebecca thought, with a strange, clinical detachment, like a man announcing a promotion at a company dinner. "Rebecca," he said, calm as a Sunday sermon, his voice carrying the same easy confidence he used to close a real estate deal. "This is Vanessa. She's carrying my son. Starting today, she'll be living here." Rebecca's coffee mug slipped from her hand and shattered against the tile, the sound sharp and final in a kitchen that had gone completely silent. Vanessa smiled. Not a kind smile, not even an uncertain one. A smile that already believed it had won a war Rebecca hadn't been told they were fighting. Daniel braced for the scream. He had rehearsed his responses to tears, to accusations, to the particular kind of rage he assumed 22 years of marriage would produce when it finally broke. What he had not rehearsed, what he could not have rehearsed, was Rebecca's smile in return, steady and unreadable, the exact same expression she gave nervous investors right before delivering numbers that would ruin their entire quarter. "Of course," Rebecca said simply, wiping her hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven door. "Let me get the guest room ready." She walked upstairs without another word, without a single glance back, leaving Daniel and Vanessa standing together in a kitchen that suddenly felt like it belonged to strangers. Because 2 days earlier, sitting in a lawyer's soundproofed office across town, Rebecca Carter had learned something that would end Daniel's entire world, something so complete and so devastating that neither he nor Vanessa had the slightest idea it existed. Vanessa believed she was walking into a new life. Daniel believed he had already won. Neither of them understood that the quietest woman in the room was the only one who actually knew how this story would end. Upstairs, standing in the guest room she had just finished preparing, Rebecca allowed herself 30 seconds, no more, to simply feel the strangeness of the moment. The woman she used to be, standing in that same hallway 22 years earlier, helping Daniel carry boxes into their very first apartment, both of them laughing about nothing in particular, certain the hardest years were already behind them. That woman could never have imagined this one, standing calm and dry-eyed, while her husband installed his pregnant mistress down the hall, 3 folders of evidence already sitting in a locked drawer at her attorney's office. She thought, too, of her own mother, gone 11 years now, who would have understood this moment better than anyone else alive. Her mother had never once raised her voice in anger that Rebecca could remember, not during the years her father drank too much, not during the long fight to keep her teaching job when the district tried to push her out for being too outspoken about underfunded classrooms. She had simply outlasted every person who underestimated her, one quiet decision at a time, and Rebecca understood now, standing in that hallway, that she had been training for this exact moment her entire life without ever realizing it. If you want to know exactly what Rebecca discovered, and exactly what she did with it, stay with me, because this is the kind of justice you don't forget watching unfold. Hit subscribe now, because we're about to go back 3 weeks, to the ordinary Tuesday afternoon, where all of this actually began. The woman who never raised her voice. 3 weeks earlier, Rebecca Carter was still, by every outward measure, the woman everyone at Hargrove Financial Group described as unshakable. At 45, she had spent 20 years building a reputation as the calmest person in any room, the senior analyst who could walk into a boardroom and deliver devastating quarterly numbers without a single tremor in her voice. Her colleagues joked, not unkindly, that Rebecca could tell you the company had lost $11 million and somehow make it sound like nothing more than a minor scheduling inconvenience. She had earned that calm the hard way, and it had never come cheap. Growing up in Shreveport, Louisiana, the only daughter of a schoolteacher and a machinist, Rebecca learned early that emotion without evidence got a person nowhere in a world that was already inclined not to listen to her. Her mother, a woman who had faced down her own share of dismissive school boards and condescending administrators, used to say that a woman who cried first in an argument had already lost it. Rebecca carried that lesson everywhere, into her scholarship interviews, into her first entry-level analyst job where she was the only black woman in a department of 40, and eventually into her marriage. She met Daniel Carter at 23, when he was 25, both of them hungry, broke, and utterly convinced they were going to build something extraordinary together. He was a charming, ambitious young man from Fort Worth, with a business degree and a genuine gift for talking skeptical bankers into loans they probably shouldn't have approved. She was the guarded, brilliant daughter of working-class parents who had taught her, in 100 small ways, that nothing in this life was simply given to you. Everything had to be earned, verified, and protected. For the first 10 years of their marriage, it worked, and it worked beautifully. Daniel built a small real estate development firm from almost nothing, one modest strip mall and one converted warehouse at a time, and Rebecca's steady analyst salary and sharper financial instincts kept them financially afloat through the years, when his projects failed more often than they succeeded. She reviewed his contracts on weekends. She caught 2 accounting errors in his first big deal that would have cost him the entire project. She never once asked for credit or recognition for any of it. She believed, the way people believe deeply in things they have invested everything into, that his success was simply their shared success, built together, brick by brick, the same way they had built everything else in their marriage. Somewhere in the last 5 years, that belief had quietly, almost invisibly, stopped being true. Rebecca was only now beginning to understand exactly how long she had been the very last person in her own life to know it. She thought back sometimes, in idle moments, to a specific dinner party 6 years earlier, when a colleague's husband had made an offhand joke about Daniel trading up someday, the kind of comment meant as flattery, toward Daniel, and delivered with no real malice intended toward her. She had laughed along with everyone else at the table that night, genuinely unbothered, secure in a marriage she believed was built on something sturdier than looks or money. Looking back now, she wondered whether that joke had simply arrived a few years early, a preview of something already quietly forming beneath the surface of a relationship she thought she understood completely. What she hadn't lost, through any of it, was the one thing her mother had actually given her that mattered more than composure, the instinct to keep her own house in order, financially and legally, regardless of what anyone else around her was doing. It was a habit so deeply ingrained that Rebecca had maintained her own separate retirement account throughout the entire marriage, modest and unremarkable, funded automatically from every paycheck since her 20s, a decision she'd made before she ever met Daniel and had simply never stopped making since. It would turn out to be one of the most important decisions of her entire life. The distance has a name. It started small enough that Rebecca almost convinced herself, for a while, that she was imagining the whole thing. Daniel began taking phone calls in the garage instead of the living room, standing near the cold concrete with the door cracked open just enough for privacy. He started traveling to Austin for what he called site visits, trips that used to take a single day and now stretched to 3, sometimes 4, with explanations that grew vaguer each time she asked. One Tuesday morning, he came home from an overnight trip smelling faintly of a cologne she didn't recognize, something warmer and considerably more expensive than the bottle he'd used for 15 years. On a weekend he had sworn, almost too quickly, that he'd spent entirely at home reviewing contracts. Rebecca did not confront him. She had learned long ago, in boardrooms far more hostile than her own marriage, that confrontation without proof was simply noise, and noise never won anything worth winning. Instead, she watched, the same way she watched a suspicious line item on a balance sheet, before deciding whether it warranted a deeper audit. She noticed the deliberate way Daniel angled his phone screen away from her at the dinner table now, a habit that hadn't existed a year earlier. She noticed his business partner, Marcus Webb, avoiding her eyes entirely at the company's holiday party, the particular way people avoid eye contact when they're ashamed of a secret they've been asked to help keep. She noticed the collection letters, addressed only to Daniel, arriving from banks she didn't recognize, letters he began intercepting from the mailbox before she ever had the chance to see them, a habit so smooth and so practiced that she suspected it had been going on for months before she caught it. Rebecca had spent 20 years of her professional life reading balance sheets for a living. She could smell a fraudulent number from 3 departments away, long before anyone else in the room noticed anything wrong. And something about her husband's finances, something underneath the expensive suits and the confident handshakes, had started to smell distinctly like decay. She said absolutely nothing to him. She simply began, quietly, patiently, and with the same methodical discipline she brought to every audit of her career, to look closer, already suspecting that whatever Daniel was hiding from her was far larger and far more dangerous than a simple affair. She began keeping small mental notes at first, nothing written down yet, just observations filed away, the way she'd file away an unusual expense report, the new watch he wore to a dinner with clients, the way he'd started referring to the Austin deal without ever naming a specific property, the evening he'd taken a call in the driveway rather than the garage, standing in the cold for nearly 20 minutes rather than risk being overheard inside. None of it, taken alone, would have convinced a jury of anything. Taken together, it formed a pattern Rebecca recognized instantly, the exact shape of a story someone was carefully managing, rather than simply living. She thought once, briefly, about simply asking him directly, sitting him down and saying his name, the way she used to when they were young, and broke, and still told each other everything. She decided against it almost as quickly as the thought arrived. A direct question would only give him time to build a better answer, and Rebecca had learned, across 20 years of financial investigations, that the people worth investigating were always the ones most skilled at constructing convincing answers on short notice. The folder on the desktop. The first real thread came from an accident, the way most of the important discoveries in Rebecca's life seemed to arrive. She had gone into Daniel's home office searching for a scanned copy of last year's tax return, a room she rarely entered because he preferred to keep it locked, and found his laptop open and unattended on the desk. He had stepped outside a few minutes earlier to take a call from what he referred to, vaguely, as the Austin investors. Rebecca was not, by nature or by habit, the kind of woman who snooped. In 22 years of marriage, she had never once checked his phone, not out of naivety, but out of a stubborn, almost old-fashioned belief that trust should be extended until it was proven undeserved. But the folder sitting open on his desktop screen was labeled, plainly and without any attempt at disguise, VC Holdings, Private, and her hand was moving the cursor before her conscience had fully caught up with her curiosity. Inside were wire transfer records to a company called Meridian Crest Partners, dozens of entries stretching back nearly 2 years, along with an email thread between Daniel and a man named Preston Halloway, listed simply as Investor Relations. The most recent message, sent only 4 days earlier, read, "Daniel, the Q3 numbers won't survive an audit if anyone actually looks. We need to move the funds before someone asks for documentation we can't produce. V already thinks the baby is due in October. Let's keep it that way for now, for everyone's sake." Rebecca read the message twice, then a third time, her pulse steady, even as the words rearranged everything she thought she knew about her own life. She closed the laptop exactly the way she had found it, adjusted the angle of the screen to match, and walked out of the office without making a single sound. She now had 2 facts that would change absolutely everything. Her husband was hiding money, significant money, from people who trusted him with it, and her husband had a woman he referred to only as V, a woman who apparently believed something about a due date that Daniel, for reasons Rebecca couldn't yet fully understand, needed kept quiet. She stood in the hallway outside his office for a long moment, steadying her breathing, the way she'd once been taught in a leadership seminar meant for something far less devastating than this, and then walked downstairs to finish making dinner as though nothing at all had changed. Daniel came home 20 minutes later, cheerful and oblivious, kissing her on the cheek and asking what smelled so good. Rebecca answered him easily, told him it was the new spice blend she'd picked up at the farmer's market that weekend, and watched him settle into his usual chair at the table, without the faintest idea that his wife now knew more about his private financial dealings than his own business partner did. She served dinner, asked about his day, listened to him describe a fictional site visit to a property she now strongly suspected didn't exist in any meaningful sense, and said nothing at all that would suggest anything had shifted between them. It was, she would later admit to Diane, the single hardest dinner of her entire marriage, not because of what she'd learned, but because of how easily, how naturally, she was able to sit across from him and pretend she hadn't learned it. She understood, watching him eat, exactly how much practice Daniel himself must have had at this particular skill over the past several months, and the realization left her with a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The address on Turtle Creek. It took Rebecca exactly 4 days to learn who V was, using the same patient discipline she had built over 2 decades of financial audits. Daniel's calendar, synced automatically to the shared family tablet he never bothered to check because he assumed, correctly for years, that she never looked at it either, held a recurring appointment labeled only V, Turtle Creek, scheduled every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon for what the entry history revealed to be the past 8 months. Turtle Creek was one of the most expensive residential corridors in all of Dallas, a stretch of glass-fronted high-rises and manicured medians that Rebecca had always associated with old money and new development deals, the exact intersection where Daniel had spent his entire career trying to plant his flag. She drove past the address once, deliberately choosing her lunch break, telling herself the whole way there that she only wanted to confirm a hunch, nothing more. She saw a young, visibly pregnant woman leaving the building's front entrance and stepping into a black Mercedes with a parking sticker from Daniel's real estate company still affixed to the windshield. Rebecca sat outside that building for 11 full minutes, watching the entrance, her hands steady on the steering wheel the entire time. She did not cry. She did not call Daniel. She wrote the license plate number, the building's name, and the exact time down in the small leather notebook she used at work for tracking financial irregularities, the same notebook that had once helped her catch a 6-figure embezzlement scheme 2 years into her career at Hargrove. That night, alone in the guest bathroom with the door locked, she searched Vanessa Collins on LinkedIn. 29 years old, marketing executive at a know it yet, wouldn't know it for weeks, but she had just become a single data point inside an investigation far larger and far more consequential than her own heart, one that would eventually cost her nearly everything she believed she was quietly building for herself and her son. Rebecca closed her laptop that night without a clear plan yet for what came next, only a growing certainty that this was no longer something she could manage alone, armed with nothing but a notebook and her own careful instincts. She had spent her entire career trusting process over improvisation, trusting that the right professionals, properly vetted and properly instructed, could accomplish more in a week than she could accomplish alone in a month of anxious late-night research. This situation, she decided, deserved exactly that same discipline. She lay awake longer than usual that night, not from grief, though grief was certainly present somewhere beneath the surface, but from the particular restlessness of a mind already organizing its next several moves. The same feeling she got the night before delivering a major presentation, equal parts dread and readiness. By morning, she had a short list of 3 professionals to call, written in the same small leather notebook, directly beneath the license plate and the address on Turtle Creek. Hiring Carol Jennings, Rebecca made her first outside call from a small coffee shop 40 minutes from her office, deliberately far enough from Hargrove that no colleague would recognize her voice through the noise, using a prepaid phone she had purchased with cash from a gas station 2 counties over. She had researched private investigators for 3 full days before making a single call, comparing licenses, reading public court records of past cases, cross-referencing complaints filed with the Texas Department of Public Safety with the same rigor she brought to vetting a new client's financial disclosures. She hired Carol Jennings, a former Dallas Police Department financial crimes detective who now ran her own discreet investigation firm out of a modest, unmarked office in Addison. Carol had a reputation, quiet but well-earned among the small circle of Dallas divorce attorneys who referred clients to her, for discretion and for testimony that held up cleanly under cross-examination, which mattered to Rebecca considerably more than speed. "I need everything," Rebecca told her, sliding a folder across the small table between them, the printouts from Daniel's laptop, the license plate, the building address, 8 months of calendar entries organized by date. "The affair is the least of my concerns, honestly. I need to know exactly where the money is going, who Meridian Crest Partners actually is behind the paperwork, and whether my own name is attached to any of it in a way that could come back on me." Carol studied the documents for a long, careful moment before finally looking up. "You understand that if there's genuine fraud here, and your name appears anywhere on these accounts, you could be exposed to real liability, even without any knowledge of what was happening." "I understand that better than you might expect," Rebecca said evenly. "That's exactly why I need to know everything before he decides to make whatever move he's planning." Carol nodded slowly, the particular nod of a professional who has just realized the woman sitting across from her isn't a frightened, wounded wife looking for petty revenge, but something closer to a strategist quietly preparing for a war her opponent didn't yet know had started. "Give me 3 weeks," Carol said. Rebecca didn't actually need 3 weeks to know one thing with absolute certainty already. Whatever Daniel Carter was building behind her back, in whatever combination of lies and stolen money it turned out to be, she would be the one still standing, completely intact, when the entire structure finally collapsed under its own weight. Before she left the coffee shop that afternoon, Carol asked her one more question, gentler than the rest. "Are you sure you want to know everything? Sometimes clients say that, and then they find out things they genuinely can't unsee." Rebecca considered the question seriously before answering, the way she considered every serious question put to her. "I've built my entire career on the belief that incomplete information is more dangerous than difficult information," she said. "I would rather know the full size of a problem today than discover a smaller piece of it every few months for the next 2 years. Give me everything, Carol. I can handle it." Carol nodded again, made a final note in her own file, and the two women shook hands across the small table, an unremarkable gesture that would, in the coming weeks, quietly set in motion the end of Daniel Carter's entire constructed life. What Priya found. While Carol Jennings worked the investigation quietly from the outside, Rebecca brought in a second professional, a forensic accountant named Priya Raman, who had once served as an expert witness in a Ponzi scheme prosecution that made the front page of the Dallas Morning News 2 years earlier. Rebecca had read every article about that case at the time, purely out of professional curiosity. Now she was sitting across from the very woman who had exposed it. Priya reviewed everything Rebecca had gathered over the previous weeks: the wire transfers to Meridian Crest Partners, the Q3 email openly admitting the numbers wouldn't survive a genuine audit, and copies of investor prospectuses Rebecca had quietly photographed from Daniel's office across 3 separate visits, each time while ostensibly bringing him coffee he hadn't asked for. "This isn't simply a matter of hiding money from a wife," Priya finally said, spreading 3 printed pages carefully across her desk, her finger tapping a column of numbers that meant nothing to an untrained eye, and everything to Rebecca's. "These investor documents show projected returns based on specific land parcels that I cannot find any record of your husband's company actually owning, not in county records, not anywhere. If he's telling investors he holds clear title to these properties, and he doesn't, that isn't a business dispute anymore. That's securities fraud, plain and clear." Rebecca felt something settle deep inside her chest, cold and perfectly clear, the exact sensation of a stubbornly unbalanced spreadsheet finally resolving itself. How much exposure are we actually talking about here? "Conservatively," Priya said, "somewhere between $12 and $15 million in total investor funds. Quite possibly more, once we manage to see the complete ledger." Rebecca closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, no more, no less, a small private ritual she had developed years ago for absorbing devastating news without letting it show on her face. 22 years of marriage. A husband who had built an entire empire on lies large enough to eventually destroy dozens of families who had trusted him completely with their life savings. "Document everything," she said, already standing to leave. "I want a paper trail, so thoroughly clean that no lawyer alive could ever successfully call this a personal vendetta." She was no longer simply investigating an affair. She was quietly, methodically building a case that would end one. On her way out of Priya's office, Rebecca paused at the door and asked one final question, the one that had been sitting underneath everything else she'd asked that afternoon. If these investors eventually lose everything, what happens to the families? Real people, not just numbers on a page. Priya's expression softened slightly, the first crack in her otherwise clinical demeanor since Rebecca had arrived. Some of them recover. Most take years. A few never fully do. That's usually the part nobody wants to talk about in these cases, the actual human cost sitting underneath the spreadsheets. Rebecca thought about that answer the entire drive home, past the same familiar Dallas skyline she'd driven toward for 20 years, and arrived at a private resolution she didn't share with anyone that day. Whatever happened to her own marriage, whatever she personally recovered or lost in the process, she would make absolutely certain that every dollar of evidence she'd gathered found its way to the people whose lives Daniel had gambled with, not buried quietly to protect her own comfort or convenience. The attorney, Rebecca's third and most careful call, went to Diane Okafor, a divorce and asset protection attorney with 20 years of experience representing spouses in high net worth, high conflict divorces across the Dallas metro area. She had been recommended, quietly and privately, by a former Hargrove client Rebecca had once helped guide through an especially brutal internal audit years earlier, a woman who still sent Rebecca a card every Christmas out of genuine gratitude. Diane's office was tasteful, deliberately quiet, and fully soundproofed, the kind of room built specifically for conversations that could not afford, under any circumstances, to leak beyond its walls. Texas is a community property state, Diane explained carefully, after Rebecca had laid out everything Carol and Priya had uncovered over the preceding 2 weeks. Normally, that fact cuts significantly against you in a divorce. But if your husband committed fraud using marital assets, and especially if there's clear evidence he deliberately hid funds from you throughout the marriage, that changes the entire calculation, both in the divorce proceeding itself and potentially in a separate criminal referral to the district attorney's office. I don't want revenge, Rebecca said, and mostly meant it, though a small, honest part of her recognized the lie in the word mostly. I want to walk out of this marriage with what is legally and provably mine, completely untouched by whatever eventually collapses around him. And I want it structured so cleanly that it can never be traced back to a single deliberate decision I made along the way. Diane studied her for a long moment, the particular way experienced professionals study someone they are quietly realizing they had badly underestimated. Most women who sit in that chair come to me in tears. Mrs. Carter, you are the very first one who has ever arrived with a case file more thoroughly organized than my own paralegals. I've spent 20 years of my career reading numbers that other people were actively trying to hide, Rebecca said quietly, gathering her things. I'm not about to let my own husband become the one exception to everything I know how to do. Before she left the office that afternoon, they had already begun quietly and legally separating Rebecca's retirement accounts and inheritance funds from anything jointly held with Daniel, weeks and weeks before he would ever bring Vanessa Collins through their front door. Diane also raised something Rebecca hadn't fully considered until that moment. The criminal exposure wasn't only Daniel's problem to manage. If the fraud is as extensive as your accountant believes, Diane said, sliding a legal pad across the desk, the district attorney's office will eventually want to know exactly what you knew and when you knew it. We need a clean, dated record showing you acted the moment you discovered wrongdoing, not before, and that you never personally benefited from a single dollar of it. Rebecca appreciated the caution more than she let on. She had already begun keeping her own private log, time-stamped and precise, of every discovery, every phone call, every decision, written in the same disciplined shorthand she used for internal compliance reviews at Hargrove. It was, she realized, the exact same instinct that had made her good at her job for 20 years. Never leave a gap in the record that someone else could later fill in with their own version of events. There's one more thing, Diane added, more gently than before. Whatever happens to him, whatever happens to her, you need to decide right now what kind of person you want to be on the other side of this. The law can get you your money back. It can't get you your dignity back if you spend the next several months trying to hurt them instead of simply protecting yourself. Rebecca thought about that the entire drive home, past the same intersections she'd driven 1,000 times before, and arrived at her own driveway with an answer already settled in her mind, one she would carry through every difficult month that followed. The guest room, which brings us back, finally, to the kitchen, to the mug shattering against the tile, to Vanessa's arrogant, victorious smile, and Rebecca's answering calm that had so thoroughly unsettled the both of them. Upstairs, alone, Rebecca made the guest bed with fresh linens pulled from the hallway closet and left a folded towel neatly on the dresser, exactly the way she would for any ordinary house guest. Daniel found her there 20 minutes later, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, studying her the way a man studies a puzzle he has just realized he solved incorrectly. "That's it?" he asked, an edge of genuine confusion beginning to creep into his voice. 22 years, and that's it? That's your whole reaction? "What would you like me to do, Daniel?" Rebecca asked, folding a second towel with the same unhurried precision she brought to closing out a difficult fiscal quarter. "Scream at you? Throw your belongings onto the front lawn for the neighbors to photograph and post online by morning? You didn't come home today expecting a fight. You came home expecting a performance, something dramatic enough to justify whatever story you've already told yourself, and probably told Vanessa too. I'm simply not going to give you one." Daniel's jaw tightened visibly, a muscle working beneath his cheek the way it always had whenever he lost control of a negotiation. Somewhere below them, in the room that had briefly been a home office and would now become a nursery, Vanessa was unpacking a suitcase in a house she did not yet understand she had absolutely no legal claim to whatsoever. "You'll regret this composure," Daniel said quietly, the threat carrying less weight than he clearly intended it to. "I doubt that very much," Rebecca answered, meaning every single syllable, because she already knew something neither Daniel nor Vanessa had the slightest idea of yet. Within the week, 2 of his largest remaining investors would formally demand documentation for land his company did not actually own, and the quiet, patient case she had spent 3 weeks building would very soon no longer need to stay quiet at all. Daniel lingered in the doorway a moment longer, clearly waiting for something else, some crack in her composure he could point to later, as proof she'd never really been as strong as everyone believed. When it didn't come, he turned and went back downstairs, and Rebecca heard him laugh too loudly at something Vanessa said, the particular forced laugh of a man performing happiness for an audience of exactly one nervous pregnant woman who badly needed to believe him. Rebecca sat on the edge of the guest bed for a moment after he left, alone, and allowed herself something she rarely permitted. 30 seconds of simply feeling the weight of it, the strange grief of watching a marriage end not with an explosion, but with a folded towel on a dresser. Then she stood, smoothed the comforter one last time, and went back to her own bedroom to change out of her work clothes, because tomorrow was still a Wednesday, and Wednesday still meant a 9 o'clock portfolio review that wouldn't run itself. She fell asleep faster than she expected to that night, not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear, she had learned long ago, was simply another kind of data, and data was something she knew exactly how to work with. She woke the next morning to the sound of Vanessa in the kitchen, humming something cheerful while the coffee maker gurgled, a domestic sound so ordinary, it briefly disoriented Rebecca before she remembered exactly why a stranger was making coffee in her kitchen at all. She dressed for work as she always did, chose her navy suit and the pearl earrings her mother had left her, and walked downstairs prepared to move through the morning as though it were any other Wednesday, because in every practical sense that mattered to her, it needed to be. Vanessa offered her a cup of coffee, almost automatically, before catching herself and looking uncertain about the gesture. Rebecca accepted it anyway, thanked her politely, and drank it standing at the counter while checking emails on her phone, an image so mundane that Daniel, watching from the doorway, found himself unsettled by it in a way he couldn't quite name, a discomfort that would only grow over the following weeks as Rebecca's calm refused to crack no matter what he tried. A new wife in her own mind. Within days of moving in, Vanessa had rearranged the entire kitchen pantry to her own liking, replaced the family photographs lining the hallway console with a large framed sonogram, and started referring to Rebecca, carefully only when Daniel wasn't in the room to hear it, as the roommate. She genuinely believed herself to be the future of this house, the next Mrs. Carter in every way that mattered. Daniel had told her, repeatedly and with total confidence, that the divorce was already in motion, a phrase Vanessa had absolutely no reason at the time to question. Rebecca watched all of it unfold with the same detached, professional patience of an analyst, calmly reviewing a company's financials that she already privately knew were headed for total collapse. She never once argued with Vanessa about the pantry, the photographs, or anything else. She never bothered to correct the roommate comments that occasionally reached her through mutual acquaintances. She simply continued her routine, her demanding job, her calm and unbothered to correct the roommate comments that occasionally reached her through mutual acquaintances. She simply continued her routine, her demanding job, her calm and unhurried evenings, while Carol Jennings and Priya Raman worked steadily and quietly in the background, building a case file that grew measurably heavier with each passing week. What Vanessa didn't know, and what Daniel had very carefully never told her, was that Meridian Crest Partners had already missed a critical investor disclosure deadline 3 full weeks earlier, and that 2 of his largest financial backers had quietly hired their own attorneys specifically to determine why. Vanessa believed, with the total, unguarded confidence of a woman 29 years old and deeply in love, that she had walked into the beginning of an exciting new life. She had actually walked, unknowingly, straight into the final closing months of a fraud that was about to be publicly exposed in devastating fashion, one that would take her own reputation and sense of safety down along with it if she remained close enough to Daniel when the whole structure finally gave way. Vanessa had no way of comparing her situation to Rebecca's, no framework for understanding that the calm, distant woman she'd dismissed as the roommate had already spoken to a private investigator, a forensic accountant, and a divorce attorney before Vanessa had even finished unpacking her first suitcase. She mistook Rebecca's quiet for weakness the way people often do when they've never actually witnessed real strength, which rarely announces itself and almost never needs to. Some mornings, Vanessa caught herself studying Rebecca across the kitchen, trying to read something in her expression, some flicker of jealousy or heartbreak she could point to as evidence that she had truly won. She never found it. What she found instead, though she couldn't yet name it, was something closer to pity, the particular expression of a woman who already knows how a story ends and is simply waiting, without malice, for everyone else to catch up. Vanessa filled her days furnishing the nursery Daniel had promised her, choosing soft yellow paint and a second-hand rocking chair she'd found online, determined to build something warm and stable for her son, regardless of the tension quietly humming beneath the surface of the house. She called her own mother frequently during those weeks, describing a life that sounded, even to her own ears, increasingly like a story she was trying to convince herself of, rather than one she genuinely believed. Her mother, older and considerably more skeptical of Daniel than Vanessa had ever admitted out loud, listened mostly in silence, offering only the occasional gentle question that Vanessa found herself avoiding. It was during one of these calls, describing Rebecca's continued presence in the house as temporary and almost over, that Vanessa first heard the doubt in her own voice clearly enough to notice it herself, a small crack she quickly talked herself out of taking seriously. Daniel's cruelty. As the weeks continued to pass, Daniel's practiced charm curdled, slowly and then all at once, into something noticeably colder. He began openly mocking Rebecca's silence at the dinner table, calling it cold and robotic, directly in front of Vanessa, who laughed along dutifully, even when she clearly didn't fully understand what the joke was actually about. Without any warning at all, he canceled Rebecca's access to their joint credit card, a decision she discovered only when it was publicly declined at a gas station, in full view of an increasingly impatient line of customers behind her. Rebecca never once raised her voice over any of it. She simply opened a new personal account, one Diane had already carefully helped her structure weeks earlier, funded entirely by assets Daniel had no idea had already been legally separated from the shared marital estate. She paid for her own gas, her own groceries, her own entire life, without a single word of complaint or acknowledgement to him. Daniel, predictably, mistook her composure for total defeat. He told Marcus Webb, with visible satisfaction, that his wife had finally accepted reality. Marcus, increasingly anxious about the mounting missed investor disclosures that he himself was now legally exposed to, said absolutely nothing back to him. He had privately begun to wonder whether reality was actually much closer to catching up with Daniel than Daniel himself seemed to realize, and whether his own name and career would end up dragged down alongside it when it finally did. Rebecca noticed Marcus's growing silence too, from a careful distance, and quietly filed it away in her notebook, the same methodical way she filed away every small crack in the foundation that told her, with increasing certainty, that the collapse she had been patiently preparing for was arriving considerably faster than even she had originally predicted. One evening, Daniel cornered her in the hallway outside the bathroom, close enough that she could smell the bourbon on his breath, a habit that had grown more frequent in recent weeks. "You think you're better than both of us," he said, his voice low and mean in a way it had never quite been before. "Sitting up here so calm, so superior, like you're above all of it." Rebecca looked at him steadily, unmoved. "I don't think I'm better than you, Daniel. I think I'm smarter than you, and I think you're only now starting to realize how much that gap has always mattered." She stepped past him without waiting for a response and closed the bathroom door quietly behind her, leaving him standing alone in the hallway with nothing to do but absorb it. He never brought up the exchange again, but something in the way he looked at her afterward had changed, a flicker of something that might have been fear finally breaking through the anger. The following week, Daniel tried a different approach entirely, softer and considerably more calculated, catching Rebecca alone in the driveway one evening, and suggesting, almost gently, that perhaps they could still figure something out, some arrangement where the three of them might coexist without the mess and expense of a full divorce. Rebecca listened to the entire proposal without interrupting him once, and when he finished, she simply asked whether Vanessa was aware he was making this particular offer. Daniel's silence answered the question more clearly than anything he could have said aloud. "I thought so," Rebecca said, unlocking her car door. "You're not actually offering me an arrangement, Daniel. You're testing whether I still believe anything you say." "I don't, and I haven't for quite some time now." She drove to the grocery store after that conversation, bought exactly what she needed for the week, and returned home an hour later as though nothing about the exchange had rattled her in the slightest, though privately she understood it as confirmation that Daniel's confidence was beginning to fracture faster than even he wanted to admit. The folder in the glove compartment. Vanessa found her own thread of truth entirely by accident, in almost the exact same way Rebecca had found hers weeks earlier. Searching Daniel's glove compartment for his insurance card before a routine doctor's appointment, she instead found a folder addressed to a woman named Renata Alvarez, listed plainly as a Meridian Crest investor, along with a sharply worded letter demanding repayment of $400,000 within the next 30 days. She asked Daniel about it that same night, watching his face carefully. He told her it was nothing, simply a misunderstanding with a particularly difficult client, and kissed her forehead in a way meant to close the subject completely. Vanessa desperately wanted to believe him. She was 29 years old, 7 months pregnant, and had already given up her own apartment and most of her financial independence for a man who told her constantly, insistently, that she was the singular love of his life. But underneath his easy reassurance, a small, cold doubt had already taken root inside her, the persistent kind of doubt that refuses to simply disappear just because you tell it firmly to. She lay awake that night longer than usual, staring at the ceiling of a bedroom that increasingly felt less and less like her own. She had no way of knowing yet that Renata Alvarez was, in fact, the sister-in-law of a former Texas state securities regulator, or that within roughly 2 weeks, that single unassuming letter would become the exact reason her entire imagined future came apart completely, taking with it every plan she had quietly begun making for herself and for the son she hadn't even met yet. The next morning, unable to shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong, Vanessa did something she had never done before in 8 months of dating Daniel. She opened his laptop while he showered, searching his email for the name Renata Alvarez. She found nothing under that search, but she found something else entirely, a folder labeled simply Q3, and inside it, spreadsheets full of numbers she didn't fully understand, paired with property addresses she recognized from Daniel's glossy investor brochures. She closed the laptop quickly when she heard the water shut off, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. She told herself it was nothing, the same way Daniel had told her it was nothing, and went downstairs to make coffee with hands that weren't quite steady, unaware that Rebecca had stood in almost that exact spot, in almost that exact posture, weeks earlier, discovering almost the exact same thing. Vanessa spent the rest of that day distracted, replaying fragments of conversation from the previous 8 months. Comments from Daniel's colleagues she'd dismissed as awkward small talk. A strange call from a woman named Renata she'd overheard Daniel end abruptly the moment he noticed her in the doorway. None of it had seemed significant at the time. All of it seemed different now, viewed through the lens of a spreadsheet she didn't fully understand, but instinctively recognized as wrong. She didn't confront Daniel that night, telling herself she needed more information first, a decision that would have surprised Rebecca had she known about it, only in how familiar the instinct was. 2 women in the same house, connected by the same man, had independently arrived at the exact same conclusion, that some truths were too important to raise without proof standing firmly behind them. The complaint. Rebecca received the call from Carol Jennings on a quiet Thursday afternoon, standing alone in the parking garage beneath Hargrove Financial, the exact spot where she had taken to receiving the calls she absolutely could not risk anyone overhearing inside the building. "Renata Alvarez isn't simply an investor," Carol said, her voice carrying the particular urgency of someone delivering genuinely significant news. "She's the sister-in-law of a former Texas state securities regulator. She's already filed a formal documented complaint with the Texas State Securities Board. This isn't a private matter contained to a handful of people anymore, Rebecca. It's going to become public, and considerably sooner than any of us originally expected." Rebecca closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. How soon is soon, realistically? "Weeks," Carol said. "Possibly less than that." "Then I need absolutely everything finalized before it becomes public," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the sudden acceleration of a timeline she had spent weeks carefully managing. "Every asset, every account, every single piece of documentation. I want to be completely and legally clear of all of this before his entire world collapses, not caught somewhere inside it when it finally does." She hung up the phone and sat alone in her car for a long moment afterward, quietly aware that somewhere across town, Vanessa was very likely still folding tiny baby clothes into drawers of a nursery in a house that would not belong to Daniel for very much longer, living inside a version of her future that was about to end before it had ever properly had the chance to begin. Rebecca called Priya next, then Diane, laying out the accelerated timeline to both of them in the same measured tone she used for delivering bad quarterly numbers to a room full of nervous executives. Diane responded immediately, rescheduling 2 other client meetings to spend the rest of the afternoon finalizing the last of Rebecca's asset transfers. Priya promised a preliminary written summary of the fraud's total scope within 48 hours, faster than she'd originally estimated, because, as she put it, once a state regulator gets involved, everyone's timeline gets shorter whether they're ready or not. By the time Rebecca drove home that evening, the plan that had taken 3 careful weeks to build was fully in motion, every account separated, every document copied and stored securely off-site, every signature already gathered. All that remained now was waiting for the first domino to fall in public, and Rebecca had never been afraid of waiting. She had built an entire career on it. She stopped at a red light 2 blocks from home and found herself thinking, unexpectedly, about the day she'd married Daniel. A small ceremony in her parents' backyard in Shreveport, string lights and folding chairs, and her mother crying happy tears into a paper napkin. She had believed, completely and without reservation, that the man standing across from her that day would spend the rest of his life protecting the things they were building together. She didn't hate him for the person he'd become, not exactly. She simply no longer recognized him, and grieving the loss of a person you thought you knew, she was discovering, felt entirely different from grieving the loss of the relationship itself. The light turned green. Rebecca drove the rest of the way home in silence, already mentally reviewing tomorrow's portfolio numbers, because grief, however real, had never once stopped her from doing her job well, and she saw no reason to let it start now. Served, Diane Okafor filed the divorce petition quietly on a Monday morning, the timing deliberately chosen to land before news of the securities complaint could realistically reach the local press. The filing formally cited the marriage's irretrievable breakdown, and in a separate, confidential accompanying filing carefully documented Daniel's undisclosed business debts and his ongoing cohabitation with another woman during the course of the marriage, a detail Texas family courts do meaningfully consider when dividing community property in cases like this one. Daniel was served at his own office, in front of Marcus Webb and two visibly uncomfortable junior associates, a moment Rebecca had not deliberately orchestrated, but also did not particularly regret once she learned how it had unfolded. He called her that same evening, genuinely furious, demanding to know why she hadn't given him any warning at all. "You didn't warn me either," Rebecca said quietly, without raising her voice even slightly, "the day you brought Vanessa through our front door." She hung up before he had the chance to answer, and for the first time in what felt like months, allowed herself a single, deliberate breath of something close to relief, quickly followed by the sober understanding that the hardest part of all of this, watching everything Daniel had spent years building come apart in front of a pregnant young woman who had trusted him completely, was very likely still ahead of her, and there was nothing left to do now but wait for it to arrive. Vanessa heard about the divorce filing from Daniel himself that same night, delivered as a clipped, bitter aside rather than any real explanation. "Your wife filed," she said carefully, testing the word wife out loud for what felt like the first time since she'd moved in, suddenly aware of how strange it sounded coming from her own mouth. Daniel didn't answer, pouring himself a drink instead, and Vanessa understood, watching him, that whatever certainty he'd carried into that kitchen weeks earlier had already begun to crack. She went to bed early that night, her hand resting on her stomach, and found herself thinking, for the first time without immediately dismissing the thought, about what exactly she would do if everything Daniel had promised her turned out to be as unstable as the ground currently felt beneath her. Daniel, for his part, spent that same evening on the phone with Marcus Webb, his voice rising steadily as the call went on, loud enough that Vanessa could hear fragments of it through the closed office door. She caught the words, "She can't do this to me," and 22 years, and something about lawyers that made her stomach tighten. It was the first time she'd heard him sound genuinely frightened, rather than simply annoyed, and the sound of it unsettled her more than she expected. She thought about knocking on the door, offering some comfort the way she once would have without hesitation, and decided against it, staying instead in the guest room that had briefly felt like the beginning of her new life, listening to the muffled sound of a man's confidence cracking apart one phone call at a time. She thought, too, about calling her own mother that night, but stopped herself, not yet ready to say the words out loud that would make everything unfolding around her feel entirely real. Instead, she opened her laptop and quietly researched apartment listings near her mother's house in Fort Worth, a private, exploratory step she took without any firm intention yet of leaving, simply the instinct of a woman who had learned, in the space of a single evening, that it was wise to know exactly what her options were before she needed them. She closed the laptop before falling asleep, leaving the tab open in the background rather than closing it entirely, a small, unconscious decision that told her more about her own state of mind than she was ready to admit to herself just yet. The investor's call. By the end of that same week, 4 additional investors had directly contacted Meridian Crest full documentation for land holdings that, as Priya had already conclusively confirmed weeks earlier, simply didn't exist anywhere in county or state records. Marcus Webb stopped returning Daniel's calls entirely, no longer even bothering with a polite excuse. The company's shared executive assistant quietly began forwarding Daniel's calendar invitations to a personal attorney of her own, increasingly worried about her own potential legal exposure in whatever was unfolding around her. Vanessa, 7 months pregnant now and increasingly isolated in a house that had genuinely never truly belonged to her, began to notice that Daniel's once magnetic confidence had started to look a great deal more like quiet, barely controlled fear. He snapped at small, meaningless things that never used to bother him. He stopped sleeping through the night. He began taking phone calls out in the garage now, too, adopting the exact same habit Rebecca had first noticed months earlier and had long since learned to recognize instantly. Rebecca noticed every bit of this unfolding as well, from a careful and deliberate distance, and said absolutely nothing about any of it. She simply continued going to work each day, continued her calm and unhurried evenings at home, and waited patiently for the numbers to finish telling the truth entirely on their own, quietly aware that Vanessa was about to learn, in the span of a single devastating conversation, exactly how much of her imagined life had been carefully built on top of a lie. Marcus Webb, meanwhile, had begun quietly liquidating his own personal investments, a decision that would later be scrutinized closely by prosecutors as evidence he'd known far more than he initially claimed. He avoided Daniel entirely now, communicating only through a junior associate when absolutely necessary, and spent his evenings in his own attorney's office instead of at the company he'd co-founded a decade earlier. The company itself had started to feel, to everyone still working there, like a building slowly emptying out during a fire drill that no one had bothered to announce, employees quietly polishing resumes at their desks, phones ringing longer before anyone answered, the particular hush of an organization that already sensed, collectively, what was coming even before it had a name. Rebecca's own days, by contrast, had settled into something almost peaceful, an unexpected calm sitting directly beside the tension building in every other corner of her life. She worked her usual hours at Hargrove, met Diane twice more to finalize the last remaining paperwork, and spent her evenings largely alone, reading in the sunroom she'd always loved and Daniel had always found impractical. She noticed, with mild surprise, that she was sleeping better than she had in over a year, no longer lying awake wondering what she couldn't quite put her finger on, because she finally understood exactly what had been wrong and exactly what she intended to do about it. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Priya called with news that would, within days, finally bring the entire fragile structure crashing into public view. "The regulator's office reached out to my firm directly," Priya said, her voice carrying an unusual note of urgency Rebecca hadn't heard from her before. "They want our full findings by the end of the week. Once they have it, this stops being something we control, Rebecca. It becomes their case, and it moves at their pace, which is usually a great deal faster and considerably more public than anyone expects." Rebecca absorbed the news calmly, the way she absorbed most difficult information, and asked only one question in return. "Is there anything left for me to do, or is it simply time to wait now?" Priya confirmed that everything on Rebecca's end was already complete, every account separated, every document verified and submitted through proper channels. All that remained, for the first time in 3 exhausting weeks, was the waiting itself, a task Rebecca had always found came more naturally to her than to almost anyone else she knew. Vanessa demands the truth. Vanessa finally confronted Daniel on a quiet Sunday evening, the Alvarez letter clutched in one hand, 3 additional unopened collection notices spread across the kitchen island that Rebecca no longer used at all. "Tell me the truth," she said, her voice shaking slightly, despite her best effort to sound composed. "All of it. Right now, Daniel. I mean it." Daniel tried the exact same reassurance that had reliably worked on her for the past 8 months. It didn't work this time. Vanessa had spent the previous week quietly calling other names she'd found listed in the folder from his glove compartment, and every single one of them had told her some version of the same devastating story. A man who had promised land he never actually owned, investment returns that simply didn't exist, and a repayment timeline that kept sliding further and further out of reach with each passing conversation. "How much money, Daniel?" she demanded. "How many people have you done this to?" "It's complicated," he finally said, which was, in its own strange way, the first genuinely honest thing he had told her in months, precisely because it was the closest he had come yet to admitting there was no simple, comforting version of the truth left for him to offer her. Vanessa sat down slowly at the kitchen island, one hand instinctively resting on her stomach, and for the very first time since she had walked confidently through Rebecca's front door believing she had won something significant, she understood with sudden, sickening clarity that she might have walked directly into the wreckage of someone else's carefully unraveling life, just in time to become collateral damage inside it herself. "I need you to leave," she said finally, surprising herself with how steady her own voice sounded. "Not forever. Just tonight. I need to think, and I can't do that with you in this house." Daniel started to argue, then stopped, something in her face making clear that this particular request wasn't negotiable, the way so many of their other conversations had been. He left without another word, taking his keys and his jacket, and Vanessa sat alone in the kitchen for a long time afterward, staring at the collection notices spread across the island, like a hand of cards she hadn't realized she'd been dealt. She thought, unexpectedly, of Rebecca upstairs, and wondered for the first time whether the woman she'd dismissed as cold and defeated had actually known something all along that Vanessa herself was only now beginning to understand. She called Renata Alvarez directly the next morning, a decision that surprised her even as she dialed the number written at the bottom of the letter. Renata answered cautiously, clearly unsure why Daniel's pregnant girlfriend was calling her, but softened considerably once Vanessa explained she wasn't calling to defend him. "He told me the same things he told you," Renata said quietly. "Guaranteed returns, land he supposedly already owned, a timeline that kept sliding. I filed a complaint with the state 2 weeks ago. I'd suggest you start protecting yourself immediately, whatever that looks like for you." Vanessa thanked her and hung up, sitting alone in her car in the driveway for nearly 20 minutes afterward, her hand pressed flat against her stomach, turning over exactly how much of her life she was still willing to gamble on a man 3 separate strangers had now described to her the same way. The accounts freeze. The following Tuesday, the Texas State Securities Board formally opened an official investigation into Meridian Crest Partners, and within just 48 hours, 3 separate banks froze every single account connected to the company, including 2 personal accounts still jointly held under both Daniel and Rebecca's names, the very same accounts Diane had spent weeks carefully working to legally separate. Rebecca received the freeze notice from her own bank that same morning, fully expected and fully prepared for, already routed entirely around by every legal structure Diane had painstakingly built months in advance. Her own properly separated accounts, protected under the divorce filing, remained completely untouched by any of it. Daniel called her twice that day. She let both calls go straight to voicemail without a second thought. Marcus Webb had already quietly hired his own criminal defense attorney and had stopped taking Daniel's calls entirely, no explanation offered or expected. 2 local news outlets picked up the securities complaint by Wednesday morning, running Daniel Carter's name and photograph alongside the phrase "alleged investor fraud" for the very first time, a headline that would follow him for the remainder of his career, and one that Vanessa herself would end up reading, alone, on her phone, sitting in the guest room that had briefly, disastrously been hers. At Hargrove Financial, 2 colleagues asked Rebecca, carefully and with obvious discomfort, whether the Daniel Carter in the news was any relation. Rebecca answered honestly, and without elaboration, "My husband. We're divorcing." She said it the same way she might report a minor discrepancy in a budget forecast, and her colleagues, taking their cue from her, let the subject drop entirely, though she noticed a new kind of respect in the way people looked at her afterward, as though her composure through something this public had confirmed something they'd always suspected about her. That respect meant more to her than she expected it to, a quiet validation that 20 years of steady, unglamorous competence had built something in her career that no scandal of Daniel's could touch. Her supervisor, a woman named Patrice, who had worked with Rebecca for nearly 15 years, stopped by her office late that afternoon, not to ask questions, but simply to say, "Whatever you need, however this shakes out, this office has your back." Rebecca thanked her, genuinely moved in a way she didn't fully show, and understood in that moment something she hadn't quite let herself believe until now, that the life she had built independently of Daniel, brick by brick over 2 decades, was proving considerably sturdier than the one he had built on borrowed money and other people's trust. She left work that evening later than usual, staying to finish a report rather than rush home to whatever tension waited there, and drove home through a Dallas evening that felt, for the first time in weeks, almost ordinary again. She stopped at a small bakery near her office on the way home, something she hadn't done in months, and bought herself a single slice of the lemon cake she used to order every year on her birthday before Daniel started forgetting the date entirely. She ate it slowly at her kitchen table that night, alone, reading a novel she'd started and abandoned twice before, and found the evening surprisingly peaceful, given everything unraveling around her. It occurred to her, setting down her fork, that this was the first ordinary pleasure she'd allowed herself purely for its own sake, in longer than she could easily remember. The quiet didn't last. Her phone buzzed twice more before bed, both times from unknown numbers she suspected, correctly, belonged to reporters who had somehow gotten her cell number. She let both calls go unanswered, turned her phone face down on the nightstand, and slept soundly anyway, confident that whatever story ran in the morning paper, none of it would touch the parts of her life she had already, carefully, made untouchable. The headline. Vanessa read the article 3 separate times before she could fully absorb that it was actually describing the same man she had built her entire imagined future around. The reporter had spoken to 2 investors on the record, both of them describing Daniel as charming, remarkably convincing, and, in the exact words of one particularly bitter investor, willing to say absolutely anything at all to get our money moving into his accounts. She found Daniel that evening sitting alone in his home office, the very same office where Rebecca had once discovered a folder that quietly changed absolutely everything. "You told me you loved me," Vanessa said, her voice flat with exhaustion rather than anger. "You told me this house would be ours, that our son would grow up here. Was any single part of that real, or was I simply another number sitting inside one of your fraudulent accounts?" Daniel didn't answer her, because for the very first time in their entire relationship, he genuinely didn't know which version of himself had actually been lying to her all along. The man who had truly wanted her, or the man who had simply needed a convincing reason to keep believing his own inevitable collapse wasn't already happening around him. Vanessa left the room without waiting for any answer at all, and began, quietly, and for the very first time, packing a bag of her own belongings, finally understanding that whatever came next for her, and for her unborn son, none of it would happen inside a house that had been built on a foundation this thoroughly rotten. She moved through the bedroom methodically, choosing only what genuinely mattered: the small collection of baby clothes her mother had already sent, her laptop, the framed photo of her own grandmother she'd brought with her when she moved in 8 months earlier, believing this house would become a permanent home. She left the sonogram photo she'd hung in the hallway console, deciding it belonged to the version of this story that was already over, not the one she was walking toward now. Daniel found her zipping the last bag closed, and didn't try to stop her this time, standing instead in the doorway with an expression she'd never seen on him before, something closer to genuine fear than the practiced charm he usually wore. "Where will you go?" he asked, and for once his voice held no performance in it at all. "Somewhere you can't reach," Vanessa said simply, and carried her bag down the same stairs she'd once climbed, believing she was arriving at the beginning of something wonderful. She called her mother from the driveway before she'd even decided where she was going, her voice breaking for the first time since the whole ordeal had started. "I made a mistake," she said simply, and her mother, without a single question or accusation, told her to come home, that there would be a bed waiting, and nothing else asked of her that night. Vanessa drove away from the house in Preston Hollow without looking back at it in the rearview mirror, past the same intersection where Rebecca had once sat outside Vanessa's own apartment building, making notes in a leather notebook, though Vanessa would never learn that detail, and past a future that, for the first time in 8 months, felt entirely her own to decide. What Rebecca knew all along. Rebecca learned that Vanessa had moved out through a brief text message from a neighbor, not from Daniel himself, who had stopped speaking to her entirely except through Diane's office. She felt something she genuinely hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but a quiet, complicated sadness for a young woman who had never actually patiently and completely. She called Diane afterward to confirm the final asset transfers had all cleared, then sat alone in her living room with a cup of tea she didn't drink, thinking not about Daniel, but about the 18 other families Priya had mentioned, people she had never met who had trusted a charming man with their savings the way Rebecca herself once had. She thought about calling one of them, Renata Alvarez specifically, just to say she understood, but decided against it, aware that her own involvement in exposing the fraud, however justified, might feel to a stranger like something closer to score settling than solidarity. Instead, she wrote a short donation to a local financial literacy nonprofit that worked with women rebuilding their finances after divorce or fraud, the first of what would become, over the following years, a quiet and consistent habit she never once mentioned to anyone at work. Rebecca also called Carol Jennings one last time that week, not for new information, but simply to thank her, an ordinary courtesy that seemed to genuinely surprise the investigator on the other end of the line. "Most clients disappear the moment the case is done," Carol admitted. "You're the first one who's called just to say thank you." Rebecca told her honestly that she understood, better than most people, exactly how much unglamorous, careful work sat underneath a result that looked, from the outside, almost effortless. She hung up the phone that evening, feeling, for the first time in months, something close to complete. Not happy exactly, not yet, but finally free of the particular weight of carrying a secret alone. The worst of it, she understood, still lay ahead in the form of hearings and depositions and a slow legal process that would take the better part of a year to fully resolve. But the hardest part, the part where she had to discover the truth entirely by herself and decide what to do with it in total silence, was finally, mercifully over. The arrest. Daniel was arrested outside his own office 3 weeks later, on formal charges of securities fraud and forgery, directly in front of the very same building where he had once been served divorce papers in front of his own staff. Marcus Webb had already agreed to fully cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges of his own, handing over 18 months of internal company communications that thoroughly confirmed everything Priya and Carol had already independently uncovered. Vanessa gave birth to a healthy son 6 weeks later, in a quiet hospital room, with her own mother standing beside her, instead of Daniel, who was out on bond at the time and facing a preliminary hearing that same week. She named the boy after her grandfather, deliberately not after his father, a decision she made without a moment's hesitation and never once reconsidered in the years that followed. Rebecca sent a simple card to the hospital, unsigned except for a single handwritten line. "Wishing you and your son a life built on something considerably stronger than what you were given." Vanessa read the line twice, cried exactly once, and kept that card tucked in a dresser drawer for years afterward, quietly regarding it as the only genuine kindness anyone connected to Daniel Carter had extended to her since the entire story had first broken. The arrest itself made the local evening news. A brief clip of Daniel in handcuffs, being led toward an unmarked car, his expensive suit rumpled, his practiced charm entirely absent from his face, for what was likely the first time in his adult public life. Rebecca watched the clip once, from her own living room, and felt none of the satisfaction she might once have expected to feel. What she felt instead was closer to exhaustion, the particular tiredness of finally setting down something heavy she'd been carrying without complaint for months. She turned off the television afterward and went to bed early, aware that tomorrow was still a Wednesday, and that her portfolio review still wouldn't run itself, no matter what had happened to the man she used to be married to. Vanessa saw the same clip from her mother's living room in Fort Worth, her newborn son asleep in a bassinet beside the couch, and felt an unexpected wave of grief pass through her, not for the man being led toward a car in handcuffs, but for the 8 months of her life she had spent believing in a version of him that had never actually existed. Her mother sat beside her quietly, saying nothing, simply resting a hand on her shoulder, the way she had when Vanessa was a child and needed no explanation, only presence. "He's going to want to see the baby someday," her mother said eventually, carefully. "You'll have to decide what that looks like." Vanessa nodded, looking down at her sleeping son, and understood that this particular decision, unlike so many others over the past year, would be entirely hers to make, on her own timeline, answering to no one else's version of how things should go. She thought, in the quiet of that living room, about the card Rebecca had sent to the hospital, the single unsigned line about building a life on something stronger, and found herself returning to those words more often than she expected to in the weeks that followed. She had never met a woman more directly wronged by her own choices, and yet the only message she'd received from her had been one of quiet grace rather than blame. It taught her something about the kind of mother, and the kind of woman, she wanted to become for her own son, lessons she hadn't expected to learn from the wife of the man who had upended both their lives. She kept the card, eventually, in the same drawer as her son's hospital bracelet and first photograph, a strange and unlikely trio of mementos from the single hardest year of her life. The divorce is final. Rebecca's divorce was finalized 4 months after that ordinary Tuesday kitchen scene that had quietly started everything, in a courtroom considerably quieter and far less dramatic than either of them had once imagined it would ever be. Because of the thoroughly documented fraud and Daniel's deliberate concealment of marital assets throughout the marriage, the presiding judge awarded Rebecca the full value of her separated retirement accounts, her family inheritance, and a significant share of whatever remained of the marital estate before creditors and defrauded investors filed their own competing claims against it. Daniel pled guilty 8 months later to reduced charges, ultimately avoiding a full trial in exchange for a 12-year prison sentence and a restitution order that would follow him for the remainder of his life. Meridian Crest Partners was formally dissolved. Marcus Webb received probation for his cooperation. The house in Preston Hollow was eventually sold at auction to help satisfy investor judgments. The same granite countertops Rebecca had once carefully picked out, now belonging to an entirely different family who would never know the full story quietly attached to them. Rebecca watched the auction listing close from her new apartment across town, felt nothing whatsoever resembling regret, and understood, finally and completely, that she had never once needed to raise her voice to win any of it. She used part of her settlement to put a down payment on a smaller, sunlit condominium near White Rock Lake, a place with none of Preston Hollow's manicured grandeur and all of the quiet she'd been craving for years without fully admitting it to herself. She furnished it slowly, deliberately, choosing every piece herself for the first time in over 2 decades, and found, to her mild surprise, that she preferred the smaller space entirely, that the big house had always felt more like Daniel's stage than her own home. On the day the final paperwork cleared, Diane called to congratulate her, and Rebecca found herself saying something she hadn't planned to say out loud. "Thank you for treating this like a case instead of a tragedy," she told her attorney. "I think that's the only reason I got through it standing up." Diane laughed softly at that, a rare, unguarded moment between 2 women who had spent months speaking almost exclusively in careful legal language. "You did the standing up, Rebecca. I just made sure the paperwork could hold your weight." Rebecca thought about that comment often in the weeks that followed, turning it over the way she once turned over a difficult balance sheet, and decided her attorney was only partially right. The paperwork mattered enormously, yes, but paperwork alone couldn't have walked into that kitchen and smiled instead of screaming, couldn't have folded towels in a guest room with steady hands, couldn't have sat across from a stranger's mistress for 8 months without ever once losing her composure. That part, she understood now, had been entirely her own, built over 20 years of boardrooms and difficult conversations long before Daniel Carter had ever entered the picture, and it would remain hers long after every last piece of paperwork connected to him had finally been filed away for good. What she built next. 2 years later, Rebecca Carter sat behind the desk of a corner office at Hargrove Financial Group, recently promoted to Chief Financial Officer, the very first woman to ever hold that position in the entire history of the firm. On her desk sat a single framed photograph, not of Daniel, and not of the house on Preston Hollow, but of her mother, the school teacher who had first taught her, all those years ago, that a woman who cried first in an argument had already lost it before it truly began. She still thought of Vanessa sometimes, and of the young boy who would grow up knowing his father only through supervised visits and a prison visitor's log. She thought of Renata Alvarez, and of the 18 other defrauded families who had ultimately received partial restitution because one forensic accountant had simply refused to let the numbers lie to anyone any longer. She thought of Daniel only rarely now, and entirely without anger, the way a person eventually thinks about a storm that has already passed through and finished doing all the damage it was ever going to do. Rebecca Carter never once raised her voice through any single part of it, from that first shattered coffee mug to the final signature on her divorce decree. She had simply waited, watched carefully, and allowed the truth to arrive entirely on its own schedule, exactly as it always, eventually does. And when it finally arrived in full, it left her standing, calm and completely unshaken, in a life that belonged, at last, entirely to her. She kept the small leather notebook, the same one she'd used to track a license plate on Turtle Creek, and a fraud that eventually reached $19 million, in the top drawer of her new desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of exactly what patience and precision could accomplish when everyone around her assumed she had already lost. Younger analysts at the firm sometimes asked her, half joking, how she managed to stay so composed under pressure during difficult negotiations, and Rebecca always gave them the same honest answer. "You don't win by being the loudest person in the room," she told them. "You win by being the one who's still standing, with all your paperwork in order, after everyone else has finished shouting." She still made gumbo on Tuesday evenings sometimes, alone in her sunlit condo kitchen, the same recipe her grandmother had taught her, and found the ritual carried none of the sadness she once feared it might. It simply belonged to her now, entirely, the way so much of her life finally did. On the rare occasion, friends asked whether she regretted the 22 years spent building a life with a man who turned out to be someone else entirely. Rebecca always gave the same measured answer. "I don't regret the marriage," she'd say. "I regret how long it took me to trust what the numbers were already telling me. But I never once regret how I handled it. From the very first moment I understood the truth, to the very last signature on that final piece of paperwork." And on quiet evenings, standing at her own kitchen counter in a home entirely her own, Rebecca Carter believed that completely, without a single reservation left to examine. Thank you for watching Rebecca's story all the way to the end. If this story moved you, if you found yourself rooting for Rebecca the way I did while writing it, do me a favor before you go. Hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. If you haven't already subscribed, go ahead and do that now, and tap the notification bell so you never miss the next story. And if you want to see more stories just like this one, stories about strength, betrayal, and quiet justice finally being served, follow this channel because there's a brand new one coming very soon. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next story.